Good afternoon, everyone. Now, today we'll start with the world history. This is the first lecture for world history, right? Now, in world history, firstly, what we'll begin with today is a basic about, firstly, enlightenment and some basic ideas of enlightenment. You studied polity and all now, so some of these ideas would be, something that you would have covered before as well, but a bit of overlap with your polity ideas as well. Now, before we get into world history, one of the things that you must understand is that in terms of your approach for modern Indian history and world history, the approach is very different. Okay, that modern Indian history, we're trying to get into the nitty gritty of everything. This is important from prelims, this is for mains. But here, it's only the mains which is involved, right? But if, and roughly we will complete the world history portion in around 10 to 11 classes, 10 or 11 classes. Now, see, one of the differences that, say, we did modern Indian history in some 14 or 15 classes, right? And from those 14 or 15 classes, you'll get some 6 or 7 questions in the prelims examination and some three or some around 3 questions in the mains examination. So that is relatively more high yield, okay? But world history is relatively going to give you a less yield in the sense that in 10 lectures or 11 lectures will give you something at maximum of 2 to 3 questions or probably one. Okay. Now, one of the things to understand is that though this is relatively low yield, but at the same point of time, because it is relatively low yield, your another way of thinking about the whole subject must be also that okay, if this is asked only in the mains examination, I should always be constantly focused on seeing on whatever I'm reading here, how can I apply it in other topics as well. So, for example, an essay. So, what can you learn from world history that you can use in an essay? Say, in an essay that you're writing probably on ethics, or on corruption, or on creation of new countries, or on nation states, or on what is war, what is peace. Okay, because whatever we read in World War, in world history is predominantly going to be a history of wars and treaties and peace negotiations. So one of the constant features of whenever you're reading this must also be to see कि whatever you're reading here, can you apply it somewhere in your essay or in your ethics paper? Okay, so if you can keep that window open while you're reading this, that is something going to be useful. Also, one more thing that you must keep in mind is that though this is relatively low yield as compared to modern Indian history, so that is why your approach here is also going to be a bit more different. You, for example, I'll say that in terms of books, you should I would recommend no need to read any book. Okay, why am I saying so? Is that for 2 questions, reading a book is probably not a very wise strategy. Rather, you stick to the. I'll tell you a bit about the books as well, and just in case you want to refer to one or two, which or what to refer from where if you want to. But overall, say in modern Indian history, we were saying either Bipin Chandra or Spectrum or XYZ, right? Here I'm saying that I'll tell you a bit about books as well, but by and large, you must remember that whatever we're doing in the class, along with that, whatever you get in the vision printout material, that's more than sufficient. If it's coming from there, you should not be missing it. If it's not coming from there, then in all likelihood, nobody is going to do it. Okay. Now, one of the things that you must understand is that in your preparation also, it's not very important that you know every question, but you know at least those questions which everybody who has done a decent preparation knows. Okay. So, no need banging your head, sir, in this book. For example, one of the problems with world history is that no one book, there is no one book which actually, covers everything. Okay, so for example, let's just talk about the books first itself, so that one of the doubts is clarified in your mind. In terms of the books, basically what you see is that there is Arjun Dev, and Arjun Dev is the one who's also written the NCRTs, the old as well as the new NCRTs of world history. Okay, so you can refer to there are NCRTs also, and then there is another one by Orient Black Swan publication, which is a reprint of the NCRTs only. Okay, and That's by the name of world history itself. Now, in your syllabus for world history, what you see is that the whole syllabus for world history actually extends from the period up somewhere from the 1757 period or from the Industrial Revolution period to the Cold War era. Now, this includes World War One, the World War II period, and the post World War II period also. This also includes this period from 1700s to 1900. Right? In this period, you see there was the American Revolution, there was the French Revolution, then you also see there are other couple of things as well. For example, the rise of Japanese, or the Japanese industrialization, the Meiji Restoration, Industrial Revolution, all these things. So these things, what one of the problems is that most of the books that you will refer to or you will see do not cover all the things. There's some books which cover some section, there's some books which cover another section. So what are the books which are available? One is this Arjun Dev. Okay. Now Arjun Dev does not cover the Cold War era very well. It does not cover the Cold War era very well. And in fact, in the past few years where they've asked questions, because this has been newly added to your syllabus from 2012, right? They've asked questions often a number of times from the Cold War era. Okay. So, but that is not covered really well in this book. Okay. Now, there's another book by the name of Norman Lu, right? So, Norman Lu is one which, Norman Lu is the book which covers this period well. But it does not talk about American Revolution, French Revolution, or these things. So the problem with Norman Lu is that it has less coverage, or I would say, in fact, no coverage of the 1700 to 1900 period. It covers the 1900 to 2000 period. Okay. Now, so that's there. Then there is another book. I mean, there's no limit to, obviously, books. But one of the other commonly ones talked about is Jain and Mathur. Now, this is a thick book. Okay, and Norman Lu itself is also very thick. It's not a small book. I mean, Arjun Dev is something that is, again, somewhere around 250 pages, just the size of the Bipin Chandra that you get from Orient Black Swan publication, almost the same size. It's 250 pages or so. But Norman Lu is, again, roughly around 350 to 400 pages, and it does not cover everything. Similarly, Jain and Mathur also is relatively a bulky book. Now, there is no point reading a bulky book. Okay, because again, you'll not be able to revise, and none of the bulky books also cover everything. Jain and Mathur actually does cover a lot of almost everything, but it's so bulky that, unless and until you're a history optional student, does not make much sense. Okay, so which is actually one of the best books from your examination if you want to refer. I would say if you refer to the vision printout material itself, because there they've put the relevant portions from all the books. If you want to refer to a book, I will say you refer to Arjun Dev. Okay, whatever is the relevant portion from Norman Lu, etc., that I would cover in the class. Okay, and you'll for things which are not covered elsewhere. For example, there are a number of topics in the Cold War era that I'll cover in the class itself. I'll give you the handouts. So you don't need to be running. कि sir इस book में European Union के बारे में नहीं दिया है, and where should I read about it from? Because see, it's topics. Now, one thing that you must remember, at least for world history, just you should have a list of 25-30 topics. Just read them and go. If it comes from this, well and good. If it doesn't come, it's okay. Nobody is going to do it. Okay, unless and until they're an optional student. So for this, you don't need to bang your head too much. Just cover some 20. Dekhiye, always think in terms of cost benefit. If you're reading 20 topics, usme se if you get 2 or 3 questions, it's good enough. If you have to read 60 topics and then you get 2 questions, it's probably not a very good bet. Okay, so just stick to these topics. Do this much. Beyond this, if you want to read, there is no limit. Okay, so for example, in Cold War, we'll not talk about every event that happened in the Cold War, but the important ones. So there is no guarantee. I'm telling you, there's no guarantee that they cannot ask some fringe event in the Cold War era. But if they ask the major events, you must know. For example, if they ask something about the Cuban Missile Crisis, you must know. If they ask something about the Korean crisis, you must know. If they ask something about the Suez Canal crisis, you must know. Okay, so again, the emphasis here is not to cover everything, but to cover everything which is important. What is fringe? Because what we were doing in modern Indian history was also talk about fringe very importantly. This is also something that you must read. That is not what we are doing here. Okay, so that's one difference. So a Norman Lou is a good book, but unless and again, until you are a history optional student, Norman Lou is not needed. So if one book you want to pick, I would suggest Arjun Dev. Okay. Norman Lou is always thick as inquisitive. There is one NCRT also for Cold War era only. That's a contemporary world politics. It's 11th and 12th political science NCRT. Okay. So contemporary world, it's by the name of globalization of world politics. Sorry. That's basically from the Indian perspective. It's a good book, but again, if you have not read anything else and you want to read, it's a okay book. But one book, if you would ask me, I would say Arjun Dev. Okay, that's about the books. Now, anything that you want to ask me about the books, firstly? Okay, then what the next thing that we do is, again, just briefly, let's point out all the topics that we're going to cover broadly. There may be a few we may add later as well, but broadly, all the topics that we're going to cover. See, the topics that we're first going to cover here is the first important topic. There's a question on which questions can be asked in the mains examination directly is the American Revolution. And again, in the American Revolution also, what is the cause? As I told you, history is all about this only, right? Causes, the significance, etc., right? So the causes of the American Revolution, the significance of the American Revolution, and the relation, in the significance itself, we'll also talk about the relation between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. Also, apart from American Revolution, there is also another important thing that happens here, and that is the American Civil War. Okay, so the American Civil War its causes and its significance is also something that we're going to focus upon. Now, also, another topic that we're going to talk about is the French Revolution. The American Revolution, we'll see, is something that is happening from the 1760s to the 1780s. Okay? And then the American Civil War is something that is happening from 1861 to 1865, almost 100 years later. So that's something that we'll start with talking about. After that, the next one that we're going to talk about is the French Revolution. And in the French Revolution, actually, the French Revolution is a relatively lengthy topic and is a relatively important topic because, no discussion of world history, or in fact, this is not world history, this is predominantly European history that we're going to talk about. Okay, so no discussion of European history is actually complete without the French Revolution, without the role of Napoleon in it, okay, and without the significance of it. So again, the causes of the French Revolution, the significance of the French Revolution, also the role of Napoleon in the French Revolution, also the significance of the Congress of Vienna is something that we're going to talk about. Now, the Congress of Vienna is something that is happening in 1815. The French Revolution is something that is beginning in 1789. Okay. Now, the Congress of Vienna itself is a very important topic because why? We'll talk about that later. That before there was a United Nations, before there was a League of Nations, the first organization ever formed to try and establish peace or a collective security organization formed for the first time was the Congress of Vienna. Why was it formed? What was its significance? How effective was it? That is something that we'll talk about. Okay. Now, see, whenever, for example, and we'll see that there are a number of things that you can compare if you keep your mind open. This is not given in any books. It's just that something that when you read things parallelly, you can compare. For example, you'll see that the American Civil War is something, I'm just telling you, for example, American Civil War is happening something that is 100 years after the American Revolution. Okay, with the American Revolution, the Americans attained independence from the British. But with the American Civil War was around the issue of slavery. Okay, we'll talk about that. But what do you see? What is the American Revolution? If I say it is about independence from the British, what is it for? Political freedom, right? But what do I say? If I say American Civil War is about the abolition of slavery, what is it about? Social freedom. So again, you see that a country or the evolution of any country does not simply involve political freedom. It also has to have social freedom. Otherwise, the evolution of the country itself is incomplete. Okay. So why am I saying this? As for example, if you look at India, right, you'll see that again, at the time we talked about Gandhi Ambedkar debates and all of that, and you see that Gandhi is emphasizing political freedom and Ambedkar is emphasizing social freedom, right? And in the constitution also, while the constitution was being drafted, Ambedkar himself said that the aim of political equality is to achieve social and economic equality, right? And that is why he talks about what is that, that's called, the preamble also, but not the preamble, that's, no, that's something, yeah, DPSP, all of that. No, I'm saying what this is also called as the trinity of, the trinity of, I'm not remembering exactly, but this is what is called, that ultimately a mature constitution, a democratic government has to ensure a equilibrium of political equality, social equality, and economic equality. And unless and until, and all of them reinforce each other. Okay, so that's something that was talked about. Now, again, if you can see the parallel, you see that evolution of America is a classic example of how, though it was the world's first republican democracy to be established, it was not a very smooth process. Even though attained independence somewhere in the 1760s and by the 1770s, you see that it was at least another 100 years later that you see a major civil war. And that is around the issue of social inequality. So, when you can see such parallels, then you can use a lot of this information even in your essays. Okay, for example, about the French Revolution. The French Revolution and the role of Napoleon in the French Revolution tells that often revolutions are often betrayed by the so-called leaders of the revolution itself. Just like Napoleon betrayed many of the ideas of the French Revolution, even when he professed to be the upholder of the revolution itself. Okay, so a revolution is also cannot simply rely upon a blind faith in the leadership of the cannot rely upon blind faith in the leader of the revolution. In fact, accountability is very important. So, whenever, say, suppose you're writing an essay on accountability, right? And there, if you can bring in one para from world history itself, so you cannot do that thinking there. I mean, you can also do the thinking in the essay itself, but here itself, you must try to keep seeing कि क्या compare हो सकता है, and that can happen only when you have some basic knowledge of polity, economy, social issues, and Indian history as well, right? So that's there. The other important topic, and this was asked in the mains examination, this is a simple topic, and that was the Industrial Revolution. The causes of the Industrial Revolution, also why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain first. What are the causes? What are the characteristics? This question was asked in 2014 or 2015, I don't remember exactly, but one of these years it was asked in the mains examination. Similarly, another topic which is important that we're going to talk about after this are the unification of Germany. And here also we talk about causes, we talk about the role of Bismarck in the unification of Germany and the policies followed by him. Okay, so the policies followed by Bismarck and the causes and the unification of Germany itself. Similarly, another topic that we're going to talk about is the unification of Italy. And the Industrial Revolution is happening in 1757 onwards. The unification of Germany and Italy is something that is getting done by 1871. Okay, so that's the two major topics that we'll talk about here. Also, another thing that is happening in the 1860s onwards is what is, and this has been asked in your mains examination, and that was the Meiji Restoration, or the Meiji Restoration in Japan. Now, many a people thought that this was, not a question. This was a very difficult question, etc. But actually, it isn't. In the sense that it is an important topic to be covered. Why? Because the Meiji Restoration is the one is the period from 1868 onwards, with which a series of policies were introduced for the industrialization of Japan. And Japan was the first Asian country to undergo a industrial revolution. So that is what the Meiji Restoration is about. So that's something that we'll talk about. Also, then what we are going to talk about firstly are World War I, the causes of World War I, some of the major events of World War I, and the significance of World War I, or the impact. That's the same thing. Also, what we'll talk about is the Treaty of Versailles, and again, an analysis of the Treaty of Versailles, how effective it was, what were its strengths, what were its weaknesses, etc. Okay. Now, so the World War I is something that's happening from 1914 to 19. Then, what we're going to talk about, another topic that can come in your mains examination, and World War I is a pet topic. Okay, it's like standard staple topic that so they can always ask. Okay, one of the other things that can also be talked about is the rise of Nazism in Germany, the factors which facilitated it, or these are also the factors which facilitated the rise of Hitler in Germany, the factors which facilitated it, and its impact. Okay. Similarly, we'll also briefly here talk about the rise of fascism in Italy, and also a brief comparison of Nazism and fascism, how similar and different they are to each other. Okay. Now, another supremely important topic is the Russian Revolution, right? The Russian Revolution, again, the causes of Russian Revolution, the events of Russian Revolution, and also an analysis as well as and significance of the Russian Revolution. So the causes, events, as well as an analysis and significance of the Russian Revolution. This is also something that has been asked in the mains examination of Russian Revolution and its impact on post-independence economic planning in India. They can ask a separate question also on the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution happened in 1917. This year or next year, there's a high chance that, given the 100th anniversary and all of that, there's a high chance that they can ask a question on Russian Revolution in your mains examination. Okay. That's there, and again there are parallels, etc., that we'll talk about here itself also. Then one of the things also that we'll talk about is the Communist Revolution in China. Okay, the Communist Revolution in China is something which is happening by World War II, but okay, we can write down here, but we'll talk about that roughly around World War II itself. Okay, that the Communist Revolution in China is with which you see the formation of the Communist Party and the establishment of Communist Party ruled by 1949. Okay, so the factors that were responsible for, or the events actually here, it's more important is the events or what led to the establishment of Communist Party in China. Also the policies of Mao and the role played by Mao Zedong in the formation of the communist state in China as well as after that. Okay, so that's the policies of Mao and the role played by them is also something which is a important topic. One more topic that I'm just mentioning here because I personally think that they can ask this if they want to again, look at something on China apart from communist revolution, because the communist revolution everybody is going to study, right? So just a few more things apart from this are the Boxer Rebellion in China and the Opium Wars. They're happening during the 1800s. That's also something that I'll briefly talk about. Okay, so the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars, again, the causes as well as the significance of them. That's also something that briefly one must, know about. Now, also, apart from this, you see that the next topic to talk about is one of the things is the American Depression of 1929, the Great Depression of 1929. Again, its causes as well as its impact is something that one must know as it's an important event in world history, and it had an impact on the economies of a number of these countries in Europe as well as in North America. Okay, so that's also something that is considered as an important topic. And it's also one of my personal favorites, but obviously it's not that, I mean, we can't go into too much of depth, but it's, a really interesting one. Now, apart from this, also, what we are going to talk about is the League of Nations. Okay, the League of Nations was something that was formed after World War I, and that was formed to prevent the outbreak of World War II. Okay, so or to prevent the outbreak of another world war is why it was formed. So the factors which led to the League of Nations formation and and the reasons for its failure, it's something again that is an important topic. The League of Nations Okay. Another topic apart from this that we're going to talk, and this is all happening between World War I and II, League of Nations formation, all of this. Okay. Now, the next topic that we're going to talk about is World War II. Okay, and World War II is a topic. World War II is a topic which is again important primarily as to the causes that led to World War II. And here we'll talk about the role of Japan, Germany, Italy, and also the role of, appeasement policies of allied powers. Okay, so Japan, Germany, and Italy were the Axis powers. Allied ones were the Britain, France, Soviet Union, and United States. Okay, so they are the allies, whereas Japan, Italy, and Germany are the Axis powers. Okay, so that's something that we'll talk about. Also, are the events of World War II, and most importantly, the impact of World War II. One of the major impacts of World War II was the formation of United Nations. And the formation of United Nations is something which is also an important topic, both in terms of, the causes. Again, one of the topics that you commonly talk about is UN reforms, all of that, right? But one of the things that you need to also understand is the objective as to why the UN was formed. And, if they have to ask something about UN reforms, that will be asked in your international relations section. But if they have to ask something, but they can ask the same thing also about UN in paper 1 also, because you're most likely to expect that in paper 2. But even in paper 1, they can ask that discuss the objectives with which the United Nations was formed, analyze its functioning in the Cold War era, and to what extent is the need for reform. Okay, so they may not keep a separate question on reform, but may club it with the United Nations and its performance during the Cold War, and why do you think there is a need for change? Okay, so that is also something that we'll talk about, especially its performance during the Cold War era. Also, another topic that is in terms of impact is the Cold War itself, right? The Cold War began as a result of differences that had crept during World War II and had been there even before World War II. Okay, so again, the causes of Cold War, the major events of Cold War, the characteristics of Cold War, all of them are important. Now, in terms of major events, is where you see a number of small yet important topics from your mains examination point of view, because they can give a direct question on them. A direct question. For example, question asked in your mains examination was in 2014 that discuss the Suez Canal crisis and how was it a major humiliation for Britain and France. So if you know the particular issue, you can write a straightforward answer. That's a straightforward bonus question. If you know exactly what is the issue, you can write about it. Okay. So what, and these are some of the major events of the Cold War. Okay. And for example, the Korean War, the causes, the events, and the significance. Similarly, the Vietnam War, no, the Korean War is from 1950 to 53. The Vietnam War is something that starts from 1945 and ultimately lasts up till 1973. Then there is the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's something that also begins around 1959. Then also another important topic, apart from the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, is also the Suez Canal Crisis. That has been asked before. Also, what you also obviously must know very strongly is about the Israel-Palestine issue, because that's a result of World War I and World War II both. Okay, so the history of Israel-Palestine issue is something that's there. Also, apart from this, another important topic to talk about, apart from the Israel-Palestine issue and all the above other issues, is the European Union. Why was it formed? Because again, when you see, the question is not going to come on Brexit or anything, okay? But the question will come that discuss the reasons for the formation of European Union, its significance and performance, its significance during the Cold War era, and to what extent, and also the challenges that it faces today. Okay, so the Brexit issue is subsumed within the larger challenges that the European Union faces today. Okay, so again, the history of why it was formed, how it was formed, what was the objective, to what extent it is a good example, what are its weaknesses, etc. So that's also something that we'll talk about. Lastly, what has also been talked about are obviously the causes for the collapse of Soviet Union, right? The causes for the collapse of Soviet Union. So to me, these are some 2022 important topics, okay? Now there is obviously no end to what you can do. Okay, for example, you can talk about the Gulf War, you can talk about the Afghanistan War, you can talk about Iraq-Iran rivalry. There's an endless list, okay? Or the Iranian Revolution of 1979. There's an endless list. There's no point we keep on endlessly doing things. But one thing that I've not talked here in terms of this, and that is specifically about India, but that is something that we'll talk about, you'll talk about it in, did you do post-independence history? No. So, for example, that is something that you'll do in post-independence history also, something that we'll talk about in IR also. And that is NAM, okay? So, because NAM is also an outgrowth of the Cold War era. So that's also something that we can probably talk about here, or we can talk about later as well, okay? But apart from that, I would say these are some 2022 important topics. Do this much. Beyond this, there is no limit. And I'm not giving you the illusion that कि यही करने से इसी में से सब आएगा. But इसमें से आएगा तो आप कर लेंगे. That is all I'm saying. Okay. So that's there. So, and because, see, I mean, otherwise, if you do this much, and if something is coming, for example, the question that came this year, the question was, the question that came, I think, 2016, right? The question that came was that discuss decolonization in North Africa, right? The question was in decolonization in North Africa. Now, decolonization in North Africa is something that we've not, for example, have not talked to you. And if you see all this history, there is no mention of Latin America. Okay, there's no mention of Africa. Okay, so I mean, this is not exactly European. Please, भैया चप्पल लेने पैसे दो. हमको सब मना करते, कुछ तो दे दो ना. हाँ, ले लीजिए. चप्पल लेने के लिए देना. भैया वो कैमरा बंद कर दो. Now, so basically, apart from this, I don't know, I just lost this chain of thought what I was saying. So apart from this, for example, yeah, the question was on decolonization in North Africa, right? So even though nobody talks about decolonization in North Africa as something, as a specific topic, but even with this much of knowledge that NAM, one of the 5 founders of NAM, the initial founders of NAM, Egypt and Ghana, both of them were in North Africa. If one knew this much also, they could write something about it. Okay, so whatever, I mean, I will probably try and cover a few more things also about Latin America or Africa. One of the theories is of Andre Gunder Frank, development of underdevelopment and all these things. If possible, if it's not possible, I'll give a document, you read it on your own. Okay, but I'll probably try and give you some general theories, dependency theory, okay, these theories which are something जो कहीं भी fit हो जाती हैं. Okay, so one of the questions, for example, was asked in 2012 that what are the reasons that why Africa has not witnessed development. Okay, so this was one question that was asked. So that can be answered with dependency theory. Okay, so I'll probably some few things, if I'm not able to discuss in class, I'll just give, documents, you read it on your own. Okay, but this is something that we'll cover, this much so we'll cover. Now, let's quickly start with let's quickly start with firstly, let's first start with enlightenment. Now, why I'm talking about enlightenment specifically as a separate topic, though I've not mentioned it, is so that you have some brief idea, and we'll see that these ideas of enlightenment get repeated again and again. In American Revolution, in French Revolution, I'll keep saying that inspired by Enlightenment philosophers, the American and French revolutionaries were deeply inspired by Enlightenment philosophers. But what is this Enlightenment philosophy that we're going to talk about? And this information can be used even specifically in your essays, etc. Now, in terms of enlightenment, one of the first things that you must know is that what is this enlightenment about? This enlightenment is about a number of things. Okay. Now, this is a period from 1500s to 1700s in Europe. Okay. And this 1500s to 1700s period in Europe is the one, this 1500 to 1700 period in Europe is one when there are a number of changes happening. On the one hand, in 1700s, you see the Industrial Revolution. But before the Industrial Revolution, there were a number of other advances happening. Okay. One of them, for example, were the age of scientific revolution. Now, what was the scientific revolution? There were people, for example, like, no, not the political philosophy. I'm just saying scientific developments. For example, the development of the development of the telescope, right? The development of the telescope by Galileo. And Galileo, actually, with the development of telescope, proved what? That the theory of Copernicus was correct. That it was the sun which was at the center of the universe and not Earth. So there were a number of scientific developments. For example, there were other developments also. The coming of germ theory of disease. Okay, that previously before this time it was like you've committed a sin, God is angry, there's something that has come into you, that is why you've fallen sick. But with the coming of germ theory of disease, it was that there is some organism which is responsible for causing a disease. Okay, so you see a number of scientific explanations started coming. A number of rational scientific explanations were being given for events for which there were priorly supernatural or religious explanations available. Okay? And a number of these scientific explanations actually contradicted these religious explanations. Okay? So for example, this heliocentric model went against the church's model of geocentric model. Right? The church and the Bible always said that it is earth which is a creation of God, life is there on earth, so earth is at the center. But Copernicus and then Galileo's findings later showed that that is not the case. Similarly with the germ theory of disease. Okay? Similarly, for example, with Newton's discovery of the gravitation laws. These are all scientific advancements. And the aim of these scientific advancements was not to directly question the church, but they indirectly questioned the church because the explanations that they offered were either very different from what the church offered or the church had no explanation for some things. For example, the church had no explanation why an apple falls down to the earth, but Newton had. Right? So that is the theory of gravitation. So a number of these scientific developments questioned the legitimacy of the church, questioned the set of beliefs propagated by the church. Okay, and also, for example, with the development of industrial revolution, what you see is that with the development of industrial revolution, one of the emphasis was on individual satisfaction and achieving material satisfaction. Because what would the church always emphasize? That this world is not the major concern. Rather, one must try and achieve salvation, right? And go to heaven, right? All of that. But what industrial revolution was associated with was individualism and an emphasis on material satisfaction. Achieving material satisfaction within this world. Raising the standard of living within this world. Achieving individual growth and freedom within this world. So there was, you see that 1500s to 1700s, a number of these developments, which had a number of impacts on political fields, religious fields, and many other arenas. Okay, so this period is what is called as the Enlightenment era. Okay, the 1500 to 1700s period. Now, what do you see? That as a result of all of these effects, this had a profound impact on a number of other areas as well. What are the other areas? For example, in the area of political, in the area of political rule or in the area of politics itself, all these developments had an impact. Don't worry, we'll write down briefly. Okay. Now, for example, what you see in the area of political developments, how did it impact? It impacted primarily because if the legitimacy of the church was questioned, it was the legitimacy of church which was also behind the divine. It was behind the theory of divine rule. That the king was ruling. Why? Because they had a divine right to do so. And who told that the king had the divine right to do so? The church. So again, the decreasing legitimacy of church, in a way, also questioned the legitimacy of the divine theory of rule. Right? So that was also one thing that was happening. Many people question that why is it that the church, why is it that the nobility is supposed to rule us? If it is because of the divine theory of rule, this is something that, like many other explanations of the church, is probably not a very satisfactory explanation. And that is why you see that there were a number of political philosophers which came during the 1700s, which inspired by the scientific revolution, which inspired by industrial revolution and many other developments, tried to apply the same and tried to question the way political institutions were organized, or how were political institutions organized. They started questioning them. So firstly, you can write about these the important thing that we must remember are these main political philosophers. Okay, so a few things that you must firstly write down about these political philosophers are some 3 or 4 major ones. You would have heard about Montesquieu before, right? Separation of powers, but there are a few others as well. So the one of the first that you must know about is John Locke. Now, this is not a political science class. I'm not talking to you about Hobbes, Locke, all of that too much in detail. Just the basic, okay? Just like, so that you have just bare minimum to know. Now, who is John Locke? John Locke is a British philosopher, okay? Political philosopher, who in 1700s is emphasizing a very important point. One of the questions, what is happening as a result of enlightenment, is a question, basic question about why does the state exist? Who is supposed to rule? By whose authority one is supposed to rule? And when can a rule be overthrown? Okay, all of these questions. So the basic questions of political structure are being raised here as to why a king must rule. What are the duties of the king? Who has the right to appoint the king? When can the king be removed? All of these questions are being raised. Okay, so at this point of time, John Locke is of the opinion, who's a British political philosopher. He is of the opinion that why did the state come into existence? That is the question. And Hobbes and Locke have different views on this, but we're not getting into that. But John Locke says that the state is coming into existence for three purposes. He says that there was something that was called the state of nature. In the state of nature, or there was a time when human beings were born or created, whatever. But when the human beings were born, there was no state. Right? There was no king, there was no ruler. But somehow a king, a ruler, a state came into existence. How did it come into existence? And why did it come into existence? This is the question that John Locke is trying to answer. Okay? And to answer this question, he firstly states that man was free in the state of nature. Or when man first came into existence, he was free. There was no foundation, there was no limitations, and he basically led a happy life, a fulfilling and a peaceful life. Hobbes' conception is very different. He says it's nasty brutish in short, right? So, but we're not getting into that. But Locke says that when humans came into existence, there was peace, serenity, one could happily live and could explore their potential. And they devised, and the reason why state was devised as an institution was to protect the life, liberty, and property of individuals. Locke also emphasized that humans were born with these pre-existing natural rights. What are these pre-existing natural rights? These three ones: life, liberty, and property. So what is Locke saying? Firstly, Locke is saying that the state came into existence primarily for one purpose, and that is to protect the pre-existing natural rights of man. And what are these pre-existing natural rights? The right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property. People voluntarily formed the state. He's questioning firstly the idea of divine right of rule. He's not saying that the state came into existence because of divine intervention. The state came into existence because it was a voluntary union that was formed by people. People themselves came together and formed a state primarily to ensure that those who rule protect these three basic freedoms of humans. Okay, and that are the right to life, liberty, and property. So, and Locke emphasized that humans were born with these pre-existing natural rights. Locke also questioned the divine right to Locke also questioned the divine right to rule of the nobility. Now, Locke is questioning the whole idea of divine right to rule. He's saying that the state is coming into existence, which is a voluntary union, primarily being formed to ensure that these three pre-existing rights are protected. Now, the question comes. The first question that you must think is why, who said that, how did Locke suddenly have the realization that these three are the pre-existing natural rights that anybody is born with? Why cannot it be right to life, liberty and education? Why right to life, liberty and property? Or why not something else, three other things? Why is it that he is emphasizing right to life, liberty and property? Because of the fact, in fact, when you look at property, in fact, almost, and that is something that is the significance of Locke, almost every constitution that you look at is indirectly or directly talking about this only. For example, the American Revolution talks about that in the Bill of Rights, it says that the state shall strive to protect and ensure the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The word property here is being replaced in the American Constitution by the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Similarly, the French Revolution also talks about the right to life, liberty, and property. Okay. Similarly, for example, if you see in the Indian Constitution also, there is a right to life, Article 21, there is a right to liberty, Article 19, and there was a fundamental right of right to property as well. Right? So, you see that there is a phenomenal constancy in the way these ideas have found mention in constitution after constitutions. And the reason is why? Because one of the initial framers of the constitution were, and in a large number of cases, some of the major framers of the constitutions were the landed elites, or the ones who had property. I mean, if you look at 1700s, at this point of time in Europe, there is feudalism. So, who are the owners of property? Are predominantly the feudal lords. They're not the masses. Okay. So, one of the emphasis that you see here is on property is coming because the idea is that the feudal lords want to exert their authority against the king. They want to ensure that the king does not exploit them. So, it's not as emancipatory as it sounds. But again, you see that these ideas were at the center of questioning the rule of the king. The questioning the idea of divine right to rule of the king. Saying that the king is not appointed by divine intervention, rather is being appointed by the people themselves to do what? To protect the life, liberty and property. That is what is being said by Locke. Okay. I mean, one can go on and on about the details of all of them, but that's not required for us. This much is enough. The other important one, philosopher, that is being talked about, I have just realized that whatever color I use, it makes no difference. Right? But yeah, it looks good here. Right? So, the other philosopher that is being talked about, that played a very important role, was Rousseau. Okay, and Rousseau was another philosopher who was a very important French philosopher. And Napoleon very famously said, if there would have been no Rousseau, there would have been no French Revolution. In the sense that the ideas of these political philosophers, and for example that of Rousseau, were very instrumental in inspiring a number of revolutions, including the French Revolution in 1789. Now, Rousseau is the one who's behind the social contract theory. Now, what is John Locke doing? John Locke is pointing out the functions of the state, right? What are the real functions of the state according to him? That is to protect the life, liberty and property. That's what he's saying. And also, he's questioning the divine right to rule. Now, what is Rousseau doing? With a social contract theory, Rousseau is saying that again, he's also debunking the idea of divine right to rule. He's also saying that the first thing that he says is that the state is coming into existence. Why? Because people have actually, all the people living in an area have made a contract amongst themselves. And with a contract that they've signed amongst themselves, they have appointed an authority which would govern them. So people have voluntarily come together in a political association and they've appointed an authority to govern them. And this authority that has been appointed to govern them is something whose main purpose is to ensure the welfare of the subjects. That is why people have appointed this authority and have voluntarily submitted themselves to this authority. So what is the contract? Where is the contract? The contract is between the state and the people. And what is this contract about? The contract says simply that if the state is coming into existence, where people have voluntarily formed the state to ensure that the state ensures the welfare of its subjects. If the state breaks this contract, or if the ruler does not obey this contract of ensuring the welfare of the workers or the welfare of its subjects, the subjects can overthrow the state or overthrow the ruler of the state and can establish a new state. So what is being said by Rousseau? That the state, now Rousseau is saying that the state will be held accountable. That is what Rousseau is saying. That if the state does not obey the contract, the state can be overthrown, and a new state can be established, or a new ruler could be established. What you see here is the idea of democratic accountability that is coming. So he's not exactly saying, he's not talking about, he's also saying that yes, divine right to rule, nothing of that sort exists. Rather, whoever is ruling is only ruling because of a contract. And if he does not fulfill the contract, he can be replaced. That is what you have in a democracy, right? That if the ruler does not fulfill the expectations of the people can replace him, right? And overthrow can happen through the use of force, or overthrow can happen through the ballot, right? It can happen through elections, it can happen even through a revolution, right? So that's something that Rousseau is talking about. So Rousseau stated that the subjects of a state voluntarily choose to appoint an authority to govern them. The social contract exists between the subjects and the ruler that they appoint to ensure their welfare. Failure on part of the state or the ruler to obey the social contract could result in the overthrow of the ruler by the subjects. So that's also something that is being emphasized by Rousseau. Now, all of these are there in the 1700s, okay? Rousseau is the French one, Locke is the British one. Now, the third one that we are talking about is Voltaire. Now, Voltaire is not hitting out at the state. Voltaire is talking about something different, partly different. And Voltaire says, and what are these people trying to do? What are these people trying to do? These people are trying to understand Europe in 1700s and trying to understand why there is so much, why there is so much, why there are so many wars, why there is illness, why there is poverty, why there is hunger in Europe. They're trying to see as to why is it that the rule itself is something that is unreflective of the concerns of the people. Okay. So what is Rousseau saying? That the problem is what? Rousseau is saying that the problem is that the state is not obeying the social contract. What is Locke saying? That the state is not doing enough to protect the life, liberty, and property of its subjects. What is Voltaire saying? That the problem is not with the state. The problem is with the influence of church on the state. So Voltaire is the one who's talking about secularism. Okay. So what is Voltaire talking about? Voltaire points out the fact that the source of all evil in European society is the church. So he says that the source of evil is not the ruler. The source of evil is the church. Why? For example, he points out that in Europe, during 1500 to 1700 period, almost 1/3 of the land was owned by the church. The church owned 1/3 of the land. The church would also collect land revenue on its own. The church could even formulate laws of its own. And the church could even forgive punishments upon the payment of small contributions. Okay. So the church had extraordinary powers, and without the legitimacy and without the official, endorsement from the church or from the Pope, no ruler could stake a legitimate claim to be ruling a particular territory. So what Voltaire points out, that the problem is the corruption in church. The problem is the overarching influence of church on every matter, whether it is economic, whether it is political, whether it is religious, whether it is the personal life of individuals. The church and the Pope governs every aspect of European life. So Voltaire says the problem is this. And so he argues for reducing and restricting the role of church. So he says that this whole idea of, the church providing legitimacy to the rule of the state must be done away with. So he's saying that there must be no need for that. He is arguing for stripping away the church's power on imposition of taxes, or taking away the power of church in terms of the judicial powers of church, that it could forgive the sins of individual, etc. So what he is arguing, Voltaire is arguing for, is restricting the role of religion, restricting the role of church only to religious affairs, and preventing their entry into political and economic affairs. Okay. So, and that is where you see the birth of European secularism. That is the separation of religion from state in all aspects. That is what Voltaire is arguing about. Okay. So Voltaire basically argued that the source of all evil, in European society was the church. He argued for limiting the role of church to religious affairs and not interference and no interference in political and economic matters of the state. That is what is Voltaire's argument. And finally, what is Montesquieu's argument? Montesquieu's argument is what? Montesquieu is saying that the problem is not, this problem is not simply that it is the state which is, or the state which is the problem, or the monarch which is the problem, or the absolute monarch which is the problem, nor is the problem simply of that of the church. The problem is that there is too much, sorry, the problem is that there is too much power in one authority. So he says that the church also has a similar problem. There's too much power in one authority. Church has revenue collecting powers also, sorry, judicial powers also, and interference in day-to-day political matters also. So what he says is that whether it is the church or whether it is the absolute monarch, who is the absolute monarch? The absolute monarch is the one who makes the laws also, implements the laws also. He's sorry. He's also the judge. He'll make the laws. He'll also judge who is responsible for a crime. He'll also give the punishment. He'll also execute government policies. So the problem is not that with the state or with the church. The problem is with the concentration of too much power in one authority, and that is why he argues for the theory of separation of powers that you know, right? So Montesquieu argued that the source of evil in Montesquieu argued that the source of evil in European society was the concentration of too much power in a single authority. He argued for separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers, and the need to vest them in different authorities who could exercise a check on each other. Who could exercise a check on each other. So these are the major, political philosophers that one must know about. Why? For example, and you can use this information anywhere. Say you're writing in an essay or in an ethics paper. You can use this information anywhere. And say whenever you're talking about tackling corruption, or whenever you're talking about accountability of government, or strengthening and deepening democracy, say you're writing an essay, you can bring these people into your essay itself. Just a brief touch, right? So one of the things, in fact, there's something that it's often always said that essay is often a reflection of your personality. So the more dimensions that you can bring in, the better your essay would be. So I mean, if you bring these philosophers also into an essay that you're writing, that's something that is good enough. Now, with these philosophers, the first thing that we're going to talk about is the American Revolution, okay? And because these philosophers inspired the American Revolution also, and though these philosophers were during the 1700s predominantly in Europe, these philosophers had a profound impact upon the American Revolution, upon the French Revolution, and also upon a number of other revolutions even after this, okay? So that is why we were discussing them. The first thing now that we're going to talk about is the American Revolution. And in the American Revolution, uh, the first thing that we'll talk about are the causes of the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution is something that is, the American Revolution is something that we say is something happening from 1776 to 1783. Firstly, what is happening in the American Revolution? That involved it involved an armed overthrow of the British colonial power from America, North America, with French assistance. That is something that is happening in the American Revolution. Now, the first thing to talk before we actually get into talking about the American Revolution and the causes of American Revolution, and as I told you before, whenever you're looking at the causes, the better thing is to look at the political, the economic, the causes related to the army, etc. Right? So that's how we're going to talk about here also. But firstly, a brief background, and then we'll write everything together in one go. One of the things that you need to know firstly about North America is that America was always a land of settlers. Right? America, in fact, the native North Americans were the ones who were never prominently in the picture, because the first settlers to America are coming from Europe. Okay, it's not that before that nobody lived here, but those who lived here, their history is something that we don't study. Okay, that is the Native American tribes. Okay, so their history is something that we're not going to study. But the main settlers in America were the ones who were coming from Europe. Okay, and they were the ones who were coming from Britain. They were the ones who were coming from Spain, from French, or from France. Okay, so from a number of and also a number of these ones also who were coming from Portugal, etc. Okay, so there were a number of settlers who were coming from Europe to North America as well as to South America. Now, of these, when you see the history of North America, I'm saying United States and Canada both. Okay, North America. Now, when you see North America on the eastern coast of North America, you see that the most of the settlers on the eastern coast of North America were the ones who were coming from Britain. Okay, and they were coming from Britain throughout the 1600s. Okay, throughout the 1600s, a number of settlers from Britain actually came to North America, especially on the eastern coast. Okay, and these settlers were the ones who were either British citizens, okay, and they were British subjects who had been exiled out of Britain. For example, there were some who were political conspirators who had been forced into an exile and were sent to North America. There were some who were punished of sabotage or trying to instigate disaffection against the monarchy in Britain, and they were exiled into North America. They were some of the people who came to North America were also traders to begin with, to buy raw materials, to buy goods, etc., and then take that back to Europe and sell it in Europe. Okay, so even that is something that is happening. So they were British traders who came. They were political fugitives from Britain who came and settled here. Okay, and they were settling from 1600s. And from 1600s itself, what you see onwards is that both Britain and France, this Spain also, but Britain and France were the two major colonizers in North America. Now, one of the difference between South Asia and North America is the first key difference between them is that in South Asia, you see the East India companies coming first. Okay, and later it is being taken over by the British Crown. But in North America, it is directly British colonization which is happening. Okay, so it's not the East India companies coming first. So the trajectory is very different. Here, it is on the eastern coast. The territorial areas were brought into the control by Britain, and where these British citizens and residents were settling down from the 1600s onwards. So from 1600 itself, eastern coast of North America was a British colony. Okay, and you see the Canadians are predominantly the ones in Canada. The French are predominantly the ones in Canada, and also on the western coast of United States. So the western coasts of United States and Canada was predominantly under French control. The eastern coast of United States and partly the eastern coast of Canada was also predominantly under British control. That's just a background. Okay. Now, what is there is that if you remember that, so both that the Anglo-French rivalry is something that we've talked about before, right? That there was a very significant Anglo-French rivalry throughout the 1700s. So this Anglo-French rivalry has a profound impact on North America also, as we had talked about when we were talking about, you know, the Anglo-Carnatic Wars also. So this Anglo-French rivalry is something that is playing out at the same point of time when there is the Anglo-Carnatic Wars, right? And 1740s to 1760s is the time when the English and the French are in a bitter colonial dispute here. Okay. Now, before we talk about a bit of detail of this, what is also something to understand is that though from 1600 itself, the eastern coast of North America was under the British control, there was a difference in their approach in the way they treated the North American colony and the way the British treated South Asia. That in North America, their colonial control was there, but that was not of an exploitative nature. So for example, there was not a high burden of taxation, or there was no direct British rule which was there. The British the British had territorial control over the eastern coast of North America, but they never imposed high taxes. Rather, they allowed the British settlers in North America, who were the white British settlers, to form their own governments and continue self-governments. Okay, so they would elect their own local governments, would continue the self-governments in the eastern coast, and they would not suffer from any high burden of taxation either. Even though they were a part of the British Crown, the British followed a policy of benign neglect, okay, or the policy of soft colonization, which is not of an exploitative nature. So they followed this policy of benign neglect towards its North American colony. But why? Why is it that they were not exploiting or not imposing high taxes on North America? It was predominantly of the fear that if they exploited the North American colony too much, there was a possibility that the North American subjects, who were the British subjects, would actually side with French. They would, in collusion with French, overthrow the British. So why? Why was this fear always there? Because though these were erstwhile British subjects, no subjects would tolerate a high burden of taxation. Okay, and a taxation which is not being imposed with their own wishes. Okay, so it isn't that taxes were not imposed. Taxes were imposed, but taxes were imposed by the local governments, and these local governments were self-elected. So the people did not have problem as long as they could elect the local self-governments and that could impose a tax. But people would not simply tolerate a high burden of taxation which was imposed by the British Empire sitting in Britain if it did not have any representation of the people themselves. Also, the American subjects could see that if at all the British rule was become unpopular, they could always take French assistance in overthrowing the British, because the Anglo-French rivalry was always there. Also, these British subjects who had settled down in America or were the American settlers, they did not have a very strong loyalty towards the British Crown. Why they did not have very strong loyalty towards the British Crown? Because the British Crown never ensured their welfare from the 1600s. So the British Crown followed a policy of neglect. They never established some really good infrastructure, or they never improved the quality of life of its subjects in North America. It just left them alone. It neither imposed too many taxes, nor did it invest too much in improving the quality of life of the subjects. Also, a number of people who had settled were the political fugitives, right? So even that was the reason why there was not a very strong sense of affiliation or loyalty towards the British Crown. because the crown was not bringing about any active welfare of the subjects, nor, and because also a number of them were political fugitives, they had no feeling of loyalty towards the British crown. So because of all of this, you see the link between the British crown and its American subject was always very weak. Okay, and the British crown never tried to exploit, primarily because of the fear of collusion with the French. Now, from 1740s, don't worry, we'll write down. From 1740s to 1760s, what is happening is the Anglo-French rivalry, which is leading to an outbreak of a number of wars, and which is happening around the question of the Austrian succession dispute, and then you see both in North America as well as in the Carnatic region, the breakout of the wars. Now, I told you then also that with the Third Anglo-Carnatic War or with the 7-Year War from 1754 to 1763, the French were defeated in South Asia as well as in North America. With the last war, or the Third Anglo-Carnatic War, which was also a part of the 7-Year War from 1754 to 1763, you saw that the French were defeated both in North America as well as in South Asia. And that is with the Treaty of Paris, the French were forced to withdraw both from North America and from South Asia. Okay, and if you see, I mean, it will become more clear if you see this map, right? If you see this map, what you see is that all of this which is in pink, were the British colonies, including portions of Canada as well. These were British colonies before the last major war, or the 7-Year War of 1754 to 63. Okay, and before this war, the pink ones were the British colonies, whereas the yellow ones, are the ones which were the French colonies. Now, after the 7-Year War, I mean, there is a road of other countries as well. I mean, Spain, which had Florida, and then Louisiana and all of that earlier, and then French took Louisiana. So, but we're not getting into those things. The major thing that you see is that with the 7-Year War, the British take up substantial colonies of the French in both the Canadian as well as the American region, the United States region, predominantly along the eastern coast. So one of the things that you see is that predominantly with the 7-Year War, the threat of French is actually substantially diminished in North America to the British. And once the threat of French is substantially diminished to the North Americans, once the threat of French is substantially diminished to the British, you see that the British policy of benign neglect starts undergoing a change. There were two reasons why the British policy of benign neglect was undergoing a change. Why from 1600s to 1700s, almost for 1650s to 1750s, almost for 100 years duration, the British were maintaining only a loose control, was to keep the French out of the region. Okay, and once the French threat was no longer there, they started moving away from benign neglect to exploitative policy, imposing a high burden of taxation. And one of the reasons why they were very desperate to impose a high burden of taxation immediately after the 7 Years War was because I told you that 1740s to 60s, almost these 20 years of war fighting had financially depleted both the French and the British. Though the French were financially more weaker than the British, but even the British had been substantially financially weakened. So to deal with the financial impact of these wars, they were looking to improve their revenue inflow. And one of the ways was to impose more and more taxes on its American subjects. And now they could afford to do so because the possibility of a French collusion was minimal at this point of time. That is what is happening. Now, that's something that you must first keep in mind. Okay. So, in terms of the economic causes, one of the major causes was this high burden of taxation. And immediately after 1763, what do you see? That they started imposing a number of taxes. Okay. One of the tax, for example, that they imposed after 1763 onwards. So from 1763 to 1773, in a span of 10 years itself, okay, they imposed a number of taxes. Don't worry, we'll write down later. For example, they imposed the stamp tax. What was the stamp tax? That is, for any official document, you needed a stamp and you had to purchase it from the government. So a stamp tax was a tax which was applied on every property transaction or whatever transaction was happening in the commercial space. And this is over and above the local level taxations which are imposed by the local governments. Okay, but these additional taxes are being imposed by the British government or the British Crown. For example, the British also from 1650s itself had something that was called as the Navigation Acts. Okay. Now, what were these Navigation Acts? This is something that is important to know again, because if you see, for example, if this is North America and this is Europe, and say this is Africa, the Navigation Acts had a very simple principle that if at all, the British colony or the North American British colonies had to do trade only and only with Britain. They could sell their goods only to Britain and they could buy their goods only to Britain. If they had to buy or sell goods to a third party apart from Britain, they had to go through Britain. Okay. So the Navigation Acts basically said a simple thing, and that was that if suppose North America was to sell its goods in Africa, then North America would have to first go to Britain, pay a tax there, and then from Britain go to Africa. So this would increase the time, this would increase the cost, and this would indirectly mean what? That trade with other countries apart from Britain would become very difficult. So the Navigation Acts were the ones which ensured the monopoly of British over trade with its North American subjects. Okay, and basically imposed a tax if at all the North American subjects wanted to do trade with any other third country or third region. Okay, so that is something that were also there. But these acts were there from 1650s itself, but they were never implemented effectively. In fact, the British, even though from the 1650s itself, these Navigation Acts were passed by the British Parliament, they never implemented them very strongly or stringently, because they did not want to, dissuade the American subjects, the British American subjects. So, but after 1763, they started implementing these Navigation Acts more strictly. Okay, that's something that's happening. So there's stamp tax, there is the Navigation Act. There was also something that was called as the Townshend duties. Now, what were these Townshend duties? These duties were basically taxes on essential commodities or taxes on basic commodities. Say, like whatever food grains would be bought, or wood would be bought, or sugar would be bought, or salt would be bought. So it was like an indirect tax, a tax which was applied to every essential commodity of day-to-day use, over and above the taxes which the local governments are already applying. So again, the Townshend duties were also applied by the British Crown. So that's also something that is, becoming a problem. One of these commodities which was in huge demand in North America was tea, right? So tea was also one of the commodities which was in huge demand in North America. Now, tea because tea was predominantly produced in India and China, right? And from there, it was actually exported to Europe as well as to North America. Now, before this, period of 1760, what used to happen was that there were a number of American traders, okay? And what would these American traders do? These American traders, what would they do was that they would not obey the navigation acts. Because if they would obey from the navigation acts, then they would have to buy the goods from Britain, right? But if they had to buy tea from Britain, then then who would have the monopoly over the trade? Primarily the British, right? So their understanding was simple that their understanding was simple that if this was North America, this was Europe, and this would say South Asia, what they said was that what we will do before the war, what they used to do was they used to route the goods. In Europe, basically the goods would come from South Asia. From Europe, they would buy the tea from the non-British traders and they would smuggle it into North America. So they did not have to pay the taxes. And if they did not have to pay the taxes, their profits were better. And and also because they did not have to pay the taxes, the price of tea was less. Okay. So basically, they used to smuggle in the tea in huge amounts. Almost 2/3 of the tea in North America was smuggled by the American traders. And these are the American traders. So the American traders were the ones who were making profits. Even the cost of tea was low. And this was all because the navigation acts were not very strictly enforced. But after the Anglo-French rivalry comes to an end, what happens is that this arrangement changes drastically. The British Crown started cracking down. The British started cracking down on this smuggling. Okay, and they started enforcing the navigation acts more strictly. That affected whose interest? The American traders. So the American traders' interests are getting affected. On top of that, what they also did was that they granted the monopoly of selling tea in America only and only to the East India Company. Okay. So they granted the East India Company the sole rights of buying tea and selling it in North America. And this was done in return for what? In return for more dividend that the East India Company had to pay to the British Crown. Now, what did this do? The monopoly or granting of monopoly of doing trade in tea to the East India Company increased the revenue collection for the British, right? Because the East India Company had to pay a dividend to the British. It made profits for the East India Company. It negatively affected the American traders' interests, and it also partly, I mean, it did not increase the cost of tea too much. It partly did increase the cost of tea as well, but not too much. Okay, but predominantly it adversely impacted the interests of the American traders. Okay, so that's something that is happening. At this point of time, by 1770s, already there was a lot of resentment building up because of taxes on essential commodities, stamp tax, strict enforcement of navigation acts, etc., which were affecting the interests of the American traders. And then the granting of monopoly of doing trade in tea to the East India Company, and and the imposition of these taxes on tea, etc., is what led to one of the popular calls throughout the eastern coast of North America was of the idea of no taxation without representation. That the Americans had long been subjects of the British, but what had happened in the past decade was a change. And the change was away from the policy of benign neglect. The Americans had been used to, having taxation by elected local governments which were accountable to the people. And what they were witnessing from 1760s to 1770s was taxation without representation. And that is why one of the popular slogans given during this period was that any further taxes, the American people would not pay or would not obey these taxes unless and until they were granted a representation in the framing of these taxes. Okay. Obviously, the British Crown did not agree with such an understanding. And in 1773, with the imposition of the tea tax and also with the granting of monopoly of doing trade in tea to the East India Company, a number of American traders actually on the coast of Boston, and that is what led to the Boston Tea Party, right? On the coast of Boston in 1773, when the East Indian Company ships came, they threw all the cargo of the tea into the sea. Okay, and more than 350 boxes of tea were thrown into the sea by the American traders, and that is including some Native American tribes as well. And this is what marked the beginning of the American Revolution. And this is something that is beginning by 1775, starting after 1773, but and then beginning from 1775 onwards, where you see the Philadelphia Conference coming into place by 1776. Okay, and the Philadelphia Conference basically came into place by 1776, where 13 of the North American states on the eastern coast are the ones which actually jointly signed a proclamation that they proclaimed independence from the British Crown, and they said that obviously they would overthrow the British Crown. The British Crown had also struck back after 1773 itself with the Coercive Acts. And the Coercive Acts basically said that all local governments would be disbanded in Boston. Okay, and the British sent in the British army, okay, to subdue the opposition by the American subjects. At this point of time, the response of the American Revolution was a military response in opposition to the sending in of the British troops. However, the American response to the sending in of British troops was also an armed response, which was strongly supported by the French. So, though the French had not... Okay, so so after Boston Tea Party, basically what is happening is that on the one side, there are two things which are happening after Boston Tea Party. On the one side, by 1773 is the Boston Tea Party. By 1775-76, you see that 13 states on the eastern coast are proclaiming independence. Okay, that's one thing that is happening. That's the response of the North American states on the eastern coast. But at the same point of time, because they are saying that no taxation without representation, and they are adversely impacting the economic interests of the East India Company, the British Crown sends in the troops after 1773 itself. It starts sending in the troops, and it disbands the local government in Boston, in Philadelphia, and the British troops start coming in. Okay, that is what you see is the beginning of the armed conflict. Okay. Now, the armed conflict picked up pace from 1776 to 1783. Okay, for the next 7 years, there was a major armed conflict in which the Americans or the American subjects were strongly supported by the French troops. The French sent in troops, the French sent in financial assistance, and both financial assistance and a large number of soldiers to provide leadership to the American Revolution also, and to provide financial support. And it is very commonly said that without that, the American Revolution was more of a French Revolution. That the American Revolution could not have succeeded without the French assistance, both military assistance and financial assistance. So 1776 to 1783, there is this French assistance which is coming in in a huge manner, both financially as well as in number of direct military assistance. Okay, and you see that by 1783 they force the British to surrender. Okay, and the British are also forced to surrender by 1783. Okay, so that is what you see in the whole American Revolution. That but at the same point of time, I've also told you. But at the same time, I've also told you that the French were also financially weak already, right? With the 20 Years' War. But then also they are intervening in this war. Why? Because of the Anglo-French rivalry. Okay? So that's one of the major reasons that they want to get back to the British. And the Anglo-French rivalry is one of the major reasons why, despite their weak economic position, they intervene. And if you remember, just like I told you, that it was these 20 years of war fighting which led the British desperate to impose taxes on the American subjects, which became the cause for the revolution. Similarly, the French already were financially weak. Then they intervene in this war and they become even more financially weaker. And that is by 1786 onwards, they also started attempted to impose new taxes on its subjects, the French subjects. And that is what leads to the French Revolution. Okay, so in a way, their rivalry was one which did not benefit any of them, right? So, I mean, not settling the rivalry in a peaceful manner costed the British their American colony. It also costed the French monarchy their rule and led to the French Revolution. So partly the French played a very crucial role in the American Revolution. But the American Revolution also became one of the causes for the French Revolution. Okay, so I mean both of them are interrelated in this manner. Okay, yeah. Any doubts still here first?
In the 1763, during the Paris
In the 1763 Treaty of Paris. Yeah.
the French were totally abolished in the USA or Canada, or in the total of North America, or in some parts of the different.
So with the Treaty of Paris, the French are not completely gone from North America, though their territorial extent in eastern and central North America ends. They predominantly left on the western region, partly, but predominantly in eastern coast is where you see that their complete is the British control. Okay, and even you see partly in the Louisiana region, there is a substantial setback. But beyond that, you see that it isn't that they're completely, gone from the region. Okay, and that is why they're able to provide the military assistance which is required.
What has happened to the natives of America?
Okay, so what has happened? What did happen to the natives, the Native American tribes? See, the Native American tribes were always, sandwiched between the English and the French rivalry. Okay, and in fact, the Native American tribes were also at times wooed by the English and the French against their rivals. Okay, but beyond that, what you see is what you see is that the Native American tribes were not ones who were very politically empowered. In fact, they were marginalized. They were not given any property rights by the British, even on the eastern coast, not by the French. In fact, they were more and more displaced from the eastern coast, more and more towards the west. Okay, that is why, and their history also is, I mean, if you look at tribal history in general, that's almost the same story of more and more marginalization and displacement from eastern and central regions towards the western region. That is what is happening. Anything else? Okay, now firstly, let's write down the causes of see, one of the problems with world history also actually in terms of our classes is that we have no prior familiarity with these topics, neither with geography nor with actors. Everything is new only, right? So that's also one of the reasons that I mean, given the time that we have, we can't go into too much of depth. And that is why also the questions which will come for you from world history will not be too much in depth. Okay, they can be from areas that probably you have not studied, but if you have studied the area, you rest assured will be able to answer the question. They're not going to be of too much depth like you see in modern Indian history. Okay, unless until you're the optional student. So that's there. Now, in terms of causes, and actually there's nothing like world history. If you study history, there's actually no such domain as world history. But what is world history? I mean, you will say it's European history. You would say it's American history. You will say it's African history or something of that sort, or Latin American history. There's nothing like world history or anything. Okay, so that's something that is also there. Now, in terms of causes, firstly, you write the political causes. In the political causes, firstly, you write that the first point is about the Anglo-French rivalry. The Anglo-French rivalry to establish overarching or exclusive colonial control in North American continent fueled bitter wars from 1740 to 1763, ultimately resulting in the overthrow of French from the region. So that's the first political cause. The second political cause was to was a shift away from the policy of benign neglect followed by British Crown towards its American colonies from 16 from 1650s to 1750s. This shift happened primarily as the threat of French collusion with this shift happened primarily as the threat of French collusion with American subjects was no longer there after 1763. Clear? Written? Everybody written? Now, they are the political causes. In terms of economic causes, yes, the imposition of high burden of taxation since 1763 by the British Crown to deal with the financial costs of the Anglo-French wars from 1740 to 63. For example, the stamp tax, the townshend duties on essential commodities, the imposition of tea tax 1773, the strict implementation of navigation acts, the strict implementation of navigation acts from 1763 onwards, the grant of exclusive monopoly in trade of tea to the East India Company. All these measures, while increased the burden of taxation on the American subjects, they also adversely impacted impacted what? I know half of you class में हाँ बस अब चलने दो. It's like let it go, like keep writing. Like, so, and they also adversely impacted the interests of the economic interests of American traders. See, one of the things that I'll tell you actually, whenever you're writing, I mean, I am telling you from my also partly my personal experience. When, in fact, I hate writing. Okay, I normally hated writing whenever I was studying. So I would just simply read, underline, and हाँ हो गया. Okay, somewhere in my mind. Okay, now, but that didn't happen. I mean, it was an illusion to me ki, I now remember everything. So that is not how it happened, because when I was forced to write, I realized that I probably just understood it and then I've forgotten it. Okay. So when you're writing here, one of my suggestions for you is, or in any class when you're writing, is that when you're writing, probably try and foresee what is being written and try and keep revising it while you're writing. Verbalize itself internally when you're writing, because that will improve your consolidation. That's almost like a revision in the class itself. Okay, so that is also the reason I don't dictate and explain both at the same time. So that explain first, so that when you're writing, it's almost like a revision. Okay, so try to be a bit more, mentally, because there's no other way of doing it. You have to realize that it's an opportunity for you. So, and they also adversely impacted the economic interests of American traders who led a series of revolts beginning from Boston in 1773, called as the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party was the immediate cause of the revolt, as the Americans raised the slogan of no taxation without representation, raised the slogan of no taxation without representation, and argued against the British Crown imposing taxes on American subjects without their consent. The British, the Boston Tea Party is all happening in 1773. The British replied with the coercive acts of 1774, abolished the local government in Boston, and the army and the British troops were sent to suppress the American subjects. Okay. Now, the British troops were sent to suppress the American subjects. So these are the economic causes and what is the outcome. The last section of causes are that related to the army, right? The political, economic, and those related to the army. From 1776 to 1783, after the Philadelphia Conference saw the 11 eastern states proclaiming independence, 13, independence. After the Philadelphia Conference saw the 13 eastern states proclaiming independence, the American troops, with a significant French assistance, both monetary and military assistance, managed to ensure the defeat of British troops. It is commonly argued that the American Revolution could not have succeeded without French assistance. So that is the rule of the causes related to the army. So all these are the causes, and which see the conflict, which by 1783 is where you see ultimately the Americans achieving independence. Now, uh, that's there, and that is why I mean, if you see this. That is why if you see this cartoon is also saying the same thing. That, you know, the British crown or England is telling to America that we'll impose a tax on tea. The Americans throw the tea on the face of the British, and the French are smiling. Right? So basically, that's so basically, you see that is why it is very commonly argued that the French had a very key role to play in the American Revolution. Now, here is one point to just ponder over and think. See, the British Army is definitely by far one of the most powerful army of the world at that point of time. And that is why you see armed revolutions against the British were unlikely to be successful without any major assistance from outside. So even though the militant nationalists in India had a very, you know, big goal in terms of, trying to overthrow the British, you see the magnitude of the challenge was very large, right? Even in the War of 1857, where you see a number of princely states coming together in India to try and overthrow the British, you see that the challenge is bigger because of the differences on the one hand between the Indian princely states, and also because the British were militarily also very strong, right? So, I mean, that is why you see that even in the American Revolution, they had to play an important role. And the American Revolution may not have succeeded without the British, uh, without the French assistance.
इंडिया में जैसे कर्नाटक वार में फ्रेंच जो हार गए थे एंड में,
हाँ.
तो फिर वहां से भी मतलब अगर अमेरिका में जैसे हम देखा भी फ्रेंच के अनाउंस की हेल्प से जीत गए वो, तो मतलब इंडिया में इसका ऑपोजिट देखने को मिला हमें ब्रिटिश के साथ देखा ना कर्नाटक वार में।
Uh,
हैदराबाद में जैसे मैं उसका देखा नहीं वहाँ पे फ्रेंच तो ब्रिटिश रेगुलरली थे आपस में, तो डिफीट कर दिए आप फ्रेंच को लास्ट में,
हाँ.
तो अमेरिका में फ्रेंच की मदद से वो अमेरिका रेवोल्यूशन।
See, so I mean, even in the Carnatic region in India, so what he's asking is that, in Carnatic region the French are defeated, so there's no possibility of, uh, see, now, so I mean, the possibility of some form of a collaboration was there, and in fact, the French also had some collaboration with Tipu Sultan, but that was never in the form of troops. Why? Because of the fact that by 1790, already France had undergone its own revolution, and they had financed one war to their heart's content, and that was the American Revolution. So that possibility of a French support coming in a very big way was not uh, there by 1790s in case of India, because the French Revolution had happened by then. Okay, that's what, and the French monarchy had already been overthrown. Okay, that's there. Now, the next thing to talk about after the causes of the American Revolution is also the next thing to talk about is a brief about the impact of the American Revolution. And in terms of the impact of the American Revolution, it's not very difficult to understand. Firstly, the American Revolution had a direct and profound impact upon the French Revolution, which followed a decade later. So from 1776, you see is the American Revolution. By 1789, you see is the French Revolution. And it had a direct and profound impact on French Revolution. How? First point we've already discussed, that the the financial and military support extended by French monarchy further worsened its economic position, leading to proposals to increase the burden of taxation on the French people, thus precipitating a revolt. Also, with the American Revolution, what do you see? The establishment of the world's first Republican democracy, right? The establishment of the first Republican democracy. And so, the American Revolution, with the establishment of the first Republican democracy, became an example where you see the ideas of John Locke are actually being implemented for the first time with the Bill of Rights, with the American Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, where they said that the state will protect the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the American Revolution also became an inspiration for a number of European countries as well, where the people closely watched the role of the French and also the overthrow of British, where a popularly elected government was then to actually establish the rule in America after the overthrow of the British crown. So the American example was being closely watched in Europe, and most importantly also the French troops had participated in large numbers. So the French troops argued after returning from America that the same ideals that they fought for in America must be implemented in Britain as well. It must be implemented in France as well. So they said that if we fought for protection of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness in America, for Americans, then we should do the same for the French. So even the French soldiers who participated in large numbers in American Revolution argued that the same ideals must be implemented or not, sorry, must be replicated or upheld in France as well. So that is there, right? So firstly, the American Revolution is also now indirectly and directly both inspiring the French Revolution. Similarly, the American Revolution, everybody's written that much, right? Similarly, the American Revolution inspired attempts to establish popular governments after overthrowing monarchy in Latin American countries from 1800 onwards. For example, the Bolivarian Revolution led by Simon Bolivar in 1820. The Bolivarian Revolution happened in Colombia. Okay. Uh, and that happened in 1820s again to overthrow the monarchy and was closely inspired by the American Revolution. Okay. So that was also one of the major consequences of the American Revolution. Also, one thing also as a third point that you can add also is that this was the first, you can write, you just write the third point. You've written this much? Second point you've written? For example, the Bolivarian Revolution led by Simon Bolivar in 1820. Okay. Now, the third point is this tab, and that is why we say, right, that America is the world's oldest democracy. Right? So, the success of American Revolution brought a radical break with the past, where where monarchical rule monarchical rule was considered inevitable and the only option and the only option of organizing as the only option, not and, as the only option, as the only option of organizing political institutions. So for the first time in the world, you see that for the first time you see there is establishment of a republican democracy. I'm not saying democracy only because by this time in Britain, monarchy is becoming more and more constitutional. Okay, so monarchy's power in Britain also are being slowly being limited, but still it is a monarchy. Okay, so here you see a republican head or a elected one. So that's the impact. Now, written this much? Okay, so probably I'll show you a small video. Uh, hmm, uh, okay, so Yeah, this is the one. So this is the one on the American Revolution. Just a second. Okay. Is the volume?
You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party.
Is the volume? I think. Yeah. Why? Huh. Huh. After the deceit. Huh. So Cornwallis is the one. So what he's asking is, why is Cornwallis being sent to yeah. So why? I'll just answer your question. They'll say why Cornwallis. See, Cornwallis was the one who was actually in charge of the offensive in America to lead the British offensive against the American subjects during the American Revolution. But despite his failures here, Cornwallis is the one who's being sent to India after this, and that is primarily because of Cornwallis and because all these people, in fact, all of the initial ones that who came as governor generals, etc., to India were very powerful elites in themselves within the British political system itself. And that is one of the reasons they themselves came from one of the most affluent and the most powerful landed elites. And that is why Cornwallis and, for example, even Warren Hastings and these people had overarching, influence both in America as well as in, India. So given their hold within Britain itself, they were partly at times in America, and then later a number of them came to India as well. After 1780s, when, Britain is rule in America is actually coming to an end, almost all of them are coming to India in some capacity, later. So that's something, because that is one of the other areas which is a potential, valuable colony that they could control. That's the only reason why, there was this drive to get into India as soon as possible. Pardon? Only influence, yeah. That's the only primary reason for it. Now, yeah.
Sir, as we know, the Spanish discovered America,
Huh.
but the British managed to first settle.
Huh. See, the Spanish discovered America, and with Florida and Louisiana, all of that. So basically, the Spanish entry into America is happening much before. But what is to be understood is that Spain, even at its peak, was never close to the British and the French. In fact, the British and the French were militarily way more, Spain and Portugal, to be very frank, they could continue their rule only because of the fact that Britain and France were not really interested in subduing them. Okay. In fact, even in terms of their might, the Spanish Empire was always subordinate, as we'll see in the next class, were always subordinate to the French. Okay. So, for example, the Bourbons were the ones in France who also had familial links to the Spanish. Okay. Later. Okay. So, one of the things is that even at its peak, Spain was never as formidable as a power as the British and the French were. And that is why wherever you see, it is the British and the French who are there as the major powers. Okay. Anything else? Okay. So this is one on the causes itself.
You've You've probably heard of the Boston Tea Party, something about a bunch of angry colonists dressed as Native Americans throwing chests of tea into the water. But the story is far more complicated, full of imperial intrigue, corporate crisis, smuggling, and the grassroots origins of the American Revolution. The first thing you need to know about tea in the 1700s is that it was really popular. In England, each man, woman, and child consumed almost 300 cups of the stuff every year. And, since the English colonized America, Americans were crazy about tea too. By the 1760s, they were drinking over 1 million pounds of tea every year. So, when Britain wanted to increase taxes on tea in America, people were not happy, mostly because they had no say in tax decisions made in London. Remember that famous phrase, no taxation without representation? The American colonists had long believed that they were not subject to taxes imposed by legislature in which they lacked representation. In fact, rather than paying the taxes, they simply dodged the tax collectors. Since the east coast of America is hundreds of miles long, and British enforcement was lax, about 3/4 of the tea Americans were drinking was smuggled in, usually from Holland. But the British insisted that Parliament did have the authority to tax the colonists, especially after Britain went deeply into debt fighting the French in the 7 Years' War. To close the budget gap, London looked to Americans, and in 1767 imposed new taxes on a variety of imports, including the Americans' beloved tea. America's response? No thanks. They boycotted the importation of tea from Britain, and instead brewed their own. After a new bunch of British customs commissioners cried to London for to help with tax enforcement, things got so heated that the Redcoats fired on a mob in Boston, killing several people, what was soon called the Boston Massacre. Under the terms of the 1773 Tea Act, Parliament cooked up a new strategy. Now the East India Company would sell the surplus tea directly through hand-picked consignees in America. This would lower the price to consumers, making British tea competitive with the smuggled variety while retaining some of the taxes. But the colonists saw through the British ploy and cried, "Monopoly!" Now it's a cold and rainy December 16, 1773. About 5,000 Bostonians are crowded into the Old South Meeting House, waiting to hear whether new shipments of tea that have arrived down the harbor will be unloaded for sale. When the captain of one of the ships reported that he could not leave with his cargo on board, Sam Adams rose to shout, "This meeting can do no more to save the country." Cries of, "Boston Harbor a teapot tonight," rang out from the crowd. And about 50 men, some apparently dressed as Native Americans, marched down to Griffin's Wharf, stormed aboard 3 ships, and threw 340 tea chests overboard. An infuriated British government responded with the so-called Coercive Acts of 1774, which, among other things, closed the port of Boston until the locals compensated the East India Company for the tea. That never happened. Representatives of the colonies gathered at Philadelphia to consider how best to respond to continued British repression. This First Continental Congress supported destruction of the tea, pledged to support a continued boycott, and went home in late October 1774, even more united in their determination to protect their rights and liberties. The Boston Tea Party began a chain reaction that led with little pause to the Declaration of Independence and a bloody rebellion, after which the new nation was free to drink its tea, more or less, in peace.
Now, that's all about the American Revolution in all entirety. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is the American Civil War. Okay. Now, the American Civil War is something. The American Civil War is something which is happening almost 100 years later. Okay. And that's happening from 1861 to 1865. But even before the American, as we discuss the American Civil War, one of the things that you need to understand, one of the things to know firstly, is that the American Civil War is primarily revolving around the issue of slavery. Okay. Now, talking about the American Civil War, and we'll talk about that. But before this, and the war is happening from 1861 to 65. Before this, what you must know is firstly a bit about the drafting of the American Constitution. Okay. Now, the drafting of the American Constitution is something that was a long drawn process that began after 1776. Okay. Now, one of the key drafters of the American Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, was Thomas Jefferson. And you see, the Thomas Jefferson was one of the key architects of the Bill of Rights and also the Declaration of Independence, the American Declaration of Independence. And basically, what you see is that in the drafting of the American Constitution, there were almost 55 members who were elected. See, what happens after 1760s to 1860s? What is happening? That the American, or the formation of United States of America started with these 13 states of the Philadelphia Conference. And slowly, over a period of time, these states managed to convince a number of other states to join hands with these states to form a United States of America. From the eastern coast, they moved towards the western coast and also towards the southern states. Okay, so from the eastern coast towards the southern states and also towards the western states was the slow movement. And this was not a union which was happening predominantly with force, in the sense that this was a union where a number of southern states voluntarily joined the northern states and the eastern states in the union. Also, basically what you see is that a number of territories also were later purchased. Okay, for example, Alaska was purchased. For example, Florida was purchased. So over a period of time, you see from 13 states, they finally managed to become 50 and then 51. Okay, so that's a long drawn process. It does not happen in one night from 1770s onwards, but it's a long drawn process. We don't need to get into the details of it. Now, what is important for us to know is that this was a union which slowly saw a number of states joining hands together to form the United States of America. Okay. Now, the United States of America thus is being formed initially with a number of states, the southern and the western states joining hands with the eastern states. And that is why you see the US Constitution is a truly federal constitution. Why? Because all these states had their prior local governments. So they had their own constitutions or some indirect constitutions to begin with. Okay. And they had these indirect constitutions to begin with. Just a second, I need to take this call. Just a second. So one of the things to know is this is why they have a federal structure. That initially they had most of them have a self-government of their own, so they drafted a constitution of their own. And so every state had its own constitution, and because they were voluntarily coming together, they formed a central constitution also, right? Or a unified constitution also. So there was a state constitution as well as a constitution of all the states put together. And one of the things since its inception was that the US Constitution to begin with did not say anything about the right to secede. Okay, that to begin with the US Constitution did not say anything about the right to secede. Rather, it was silent on this. It was seen as a union of a number of American states coming together, and if they were coming together voluntarily, it was a matter of open question whether they could also secede voluntarily from the union. Okay, so that was there. Now, another one thing that you must know, that a number of these, out of these 55, the initial, the Constituent Assembly was composed of 55 members who were drafting the American Constitution. Out of these 55 members, 25 members, including Thomas Jefferson himself, had slaves or owned slaves as property. And the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence was silent on the issue of slavery. It said that all men would be treated equal. Okay, all men would be treated equal. But even while the Declaration of Rights talked about the fact that all men would be treated equal, it was silent on the question of slavery. So slavery was a practice that continued even after the drafting of the American Constitution and the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Okay, so this was something that continued even after 1770s. So slavery, and some of the founding fathers also had of the American Constitution had a large number of slaves. Also, this Constituent Assembly was not elected by a universal adult franchise. Rather, it was only the propertied section would had the right to vote. So again that, and women had no right to vote in selecting those who were framing the American Constitution. So that is one of the reasons why women get no right to property, no right to vote. There is no major political empowerment or economic empowerment of women that happens as a result of this Declaration of Rights that comes after 1776. Okay. Now, why am I telling you this is that for the PowerPoint, I've given a few more details about how revolutionary was the American Revolution actually. Okay. Whether the American Revolution was truly revolutionary to the extent that it was aimed at overthrow of the British and ended colonial rule, yes, it was revolutionary. But to the extent it came to empowerment of the masses, it wasn't. Why? Because even though it brought about political freedom, it continued with the practice of slavery, and so social freedom was missing. It did not bring about even empowerment of women, or did not grant voting rights to women. So it did not address the question of gender inequality. Also, it did not bring about radical land reforms. So even slavery continued. So what was happening in America was that there were a large number of American individuals who were either traders or were large landowners. They were large landowners also, and they had a large number of slaves also. The slaves would perform the labor on the agricultural land. So slavery continued, large landowners were there, and the tillers of the land, neither the common American people also did not have land ownership. Okay, so what you see is that the land ownership pattern was unequal, major land reforms were not brought about, nor was slavery abolished, nor were women granted voting rights. So many have questioned whether that the American Revolution was not revolutionary to begin with in 1776. And that is the reason that you see another major upsurge that America has to deal with 100 years later. Because in 1776, what they attained was political freedom. What they're attaining in 1860s is social freedom, and that too is not complete social freedom. That is also only primarily along the issue of abolition of slavery. Okay. So we'll talk a bit more about slavery also, but I'm just giving you, the whole context of where this is coming from. Now, what is the issue of slavery that you're seeing here is predominantly that the southern states, the southern states were the ones where plantations were a huge economic activity in America. Okay, so whether it was say tobacco later, or potato, or more importantly sugarcane, which was cultivated in huge amount in the southern states, was a huge plantation activity. Okay, and plantations required a huge amount of labor, and slaves were actually used in these plantations in large numbers. The southern states' economy was more dependent upon plantation and agriculture, and was more dependent upon the use of slavery, which was low cost labor. Okay, and slaves were also a commodity which was just bought and sold in the market as you would buy any raw material. Okay, so slaves were bought and sold in the market on a very regular basis, and because it served the economic needs of the majority of the landowners in the southern states. Okay, also keeping slaves was also seen as a matter of prestige. Okay, so, or a social status, as a large a wealthy individual would have a large number of slaves. Okay, so slave owning was also a matter of social prestige, but earlier slavery was practiced in 1700s. Slavery was practiced both in the northern states and in the southern states. But by the 1860s, you see that the extent of slavery was reduced vastly in the northern states. Why? Because the northern states were the first to pick up industrialization. And with industrialization, and movement towards industrialization, the dependence on slavery of northern states had reduced. Okay, so the northern states economy did not depend overwhelmingly upon slavery. Also in Europe, 1600s onwards itself in Europe, there was a movement towards abolition of slavery. Okay, and Britain was the first European country to abolish slavery, and as this was seen as something which was against the principles of social equality. Okay, so Britain was the first country in Europe to abolish slavery, and many argued, and especially amongst the northern states, that such a inhuman practice must not continue within America as well. So those within the northern states predominantly argued for the abolition of slavery. And one of the key individuals who argued for the abolition of slavery and who contested the elections of 1860 for the post of president was Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln in 1860 is contesting the elections for the post of the president. And contesting the elections, apart from other issues, he also promised to abolish slavery if he was to get elected. This is the reason why the southern states were very apprehensive of Abraham Lincoln and his intentions, and declared their intention that if Lincoln was to win the elections, the southern states would not accept Lincoln's presidency and would secede from the states, from the United States, and would form a union of their own. Okay, because the American Constitution was always silent on this issue, whether the states could secede or not. So in 1861, when finally Lincoln was elected as the president, the southern states declared their intention of declaring independence from the northern states and forming a union of their own. At this point of time, Lincoln first approached the southern states and tried to reassure them that he will not push in abolition of slavery in southern states without the consent of the southern states. And he tried to reassure them that they must not try to secede from the northern states. And but when the southern states did not relent upon their position, Lincoln pointed out that Lincoln said that the American Constitution does not allow the right to secede, and he sent in the American army in the southern states to crush any opposition or any attempts to bring about a succession of the southern states. And that is why you see the American Civil War began from 1861 to 1865. And that is why over the next 4 years you see the American Civil War, where the American army predominantly crushed the attempt of the southern states to secede. And you see, as a result of this, after 1865, there is firstly the 13th Amendment which was brought in. And the 13th Amendment was brought in the American Constitution, which clearly and specifically stated that the states have no right to secede, even though this was a voluntary union. That the states cannot secede, even though this was a voluntary union. Okay, that's one thing. Secondly, also what happens as a consequence of this is that the American army and the expenditure on the American army was vastly increased to increase their numbers and to increase their military strength, so as to ensure that they could subdue the southern states. Okay, and that is why you see that the strength of the American army and the expenditure on it increased vastly, increasing the military strength of the American army in general. Also, obviously, as a consequence of this, slavery came to an end. Now, one thing also I must clarify, that the abolition of slavery does not mean equal voting rights or equal political rights for the black population. That did not happen. It's only that slaves could no longer be bought and sold in the market. Okay, so slavery was abolished, but did not mean that there was political and social equality for the black population. Rather, the blacks still did not have or continued to did not immediately get voting rights also. They continued to face segregation in public spaces, but the only relaxation that they got was that they could not be bought and sold in the market. They were not a property of anybody. But as considered, as regarding their status in the American society, they still faced social inequality. That is why in 1950s, you see the American civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., all of that, right? So that is why in 1950s you're seeing the American, civil rights movement, which is arguing for ending to segregation, equal voting rights, all of that, right? So what do you see in American history? And also the American Civil War does nothing about women rights. Women rights are coming much later in 1928, okay, voting rights for women. Okay, so what do you see in American history? That though America attained independence from Britain in 1770s itself, though America attained independence or political independence from Britain itself in 1770s, its journey towards social freedom of the blacks or of women was a long drawn affair. And that is why when you see in comparison to the Americans, the example of the Indian freedom struggle and the Indian constitution to begin with itself was a far-reaching constitution, which talked about political and social equality as well as the need to establish economic equality as well. So that is why when you look at the Indian constitution, it is a far more evolved document, a far-reaching document as compared to the American Constitution that was there in 1776. So that's why, that's there. Because in a one stroke, we are granting equal voting rights to all without any property disqualifications or educational disqualifications, including to women, for abolition of untouchability, affirmative policies for the backward castes, etc. Right? So all of that is there in the Indian Constitution, right? So that's something. Now, any doubts still here, firstly? No doubts? Okay, now let's... See, were the slaves granted citizenship of America? See, property rights and all these things were granted eventually, but not substantially. I mean, were granted eventually, not immediately after 1765. Okay, that's there. Now, let's firstly write down about the causes of American Civil War and then the impact or the significance of the American Civil War. I'm not writing about how revolutionary was the American Civil War. I've given that in the PowerPoint presentation. See, in at least in world history, what we will be doing is that there would be some places where I'll tell you that I'm not dictating this. Okay, because otherwise we have to cover a lot of ground. But most of the things I would dictate, but there's some things that I'll tell you specifically, it's there in the PPT. You can look at that, okay, from there. So, because if at all, see, from the mains examination, what can be the 3 questions that can be framed from here? One question can be about discuss the causes of the American Revolution and its impact upon Europe. Okay. That's one question that can come. The other question that can be framed can be on the American Civil War. Discuss the causes of the American Civil War and to what extent it carried forward the unfinished agenda of the American Revolution. That's the second question which can be framed here. The third question which can be framed here is also to what extent the American Constitution was a revolutionary document, or the American Declaration of Rights was a revolutionary document. Okay, so that's another. Okay, so let's write down about the American Civil War first.
Was the rights only the issue for American Revolution?
Pardon, I didn't get the question.
Like the the developments that happened, like the philosophical developments and all. Did they affect the American Revolution or only about these rights?
In fact, in terms of American Revolution, now that you have asked, one of the things that I must mention that when we are talking about all these causes, okay, of the American Revolution, so what he's asking is the role of political philosophers also important in the American Revolution? See, all the Enlightenment thinkers that we've talked about, you can always write that also as a ideological causes or support, ideological causes or support that came to the American Revolution from the ideas of Locke, from the ideas of other European philosophers. Okay, so the ideological causes, in terms of that, you can also write down about the whether the Locke's ideas are ones which are finding representation here, or the simple idea of no taxation without representation. Right. So these political ideas itself are also the reason which partly inspired the American Revolution. These ideas are also the ones which are inspiring later the French Revolution also. Okay, so that's something that can be added in the French Revolution, also including the American Revolution. Clear? Okay. Anything else? Okay, let's write. In terms of the causes, the American Civil War was a result of a major dispute between the northern and southern states. The American Civil War was a result of a major dispute between the northern and southern states in the United States of America over two issues. A, abolition of slavery. While the northern states, which had moved towards industrialization, supported the abolition of slavery. The southern states were predominantly dependent on agriculture, upon agriculture, specifically plantations, and hence used slave labor in large amount. Moreover, slave ownership was seen as a reflection of social status in southern states. This economic and social role of slavery in southern states saw This economic and social role of slavery in southern states saw them opposing any move to abolish slavery. The second issue is the dispute over the existence of a right to secede. Lincoln's open support for the cause of abolition of slavery. Lincoln's open support for the cause of abolition of slavery saw the southern states proclaiming their intention to secede and form a union of their own. However, Lincoln clarified that though the union of states was voluntary, the states enjoyed no right to secede. Though the union was voluntary, the states enjoyed no right to secede. Thus, from 1861 to 1865, the armed conflict broke out as southern states attempted succession and the American army was sent to crush southern states attempted succession and the American army was sent to crush the attempt, leading to the American Civil War. Written? Okay. So, one more thing, as I always say, if you write slower than I am writing, you will go extinct. नहीं होगा paper आपका पूरा. You should be writing faster than I am, because I could never complete the paper. Okay. So, you should not land yourself in a similar position. Okay. That's it. Now, in terms of impact, we'll write the impact in the next class. Okay. I'll give